Hi, I'm Othais, and this is a reproduction of Colt's improved model holster pistol, later known as the old model Army revolver. However, most people today would actually just call it the Colt Dragoon. Let's go ahead and get it over the light box though. Weighing in at 4.1 pounds and with an overall length of 14 1/4 inch, this is a very large service revolver. However, at the time, it was practically compact compared to the original Walker. Also, like its precursor, this is a single action only, muzzle loading, percussion cap firing, 6-shot 44 bore revolver. We'll get into all those details in a moment. Welcome back to another Reprocussion episode where we use a reproduction percussion cap firearm in order to tell the story of a much more rare and valuable original. If you do happen to be curious about those particular treasures, the originals, I have good news. Rock Island Auction House has helped produce this and other episodes about Colt's percussion revolvers, precisely because they want people to know the history and they'd like you to know that they are experts in this particular collector's market. Every time we do one of these episodes, I get a lot of questions about rarity, value, and maybe how to avoid fakes, right? Unfortunately, I'm not a regular buyer or seller of original artifacts, I'm just a historian. Rock Island Auction though, well, you should go ahead and stop by their site, talk to them, tell them, thank you for supporting going through the actual history. Before we even get started on this revolver today, I have to go ahead and plant a huge pink asterisk on, all of this. Presently, the research and writing process for this episode is the longest in CNR Soul's history. This is mostly due to the unfortunately poor quality of available reading, and yet tons of available reading. Most of the books are very dated, they're loose on their source material, they make strange assumptions, and they don't always align with what we see in the guns. During what should have been the, let's say, review and reform era of writing, the Colt marketplace became dominated by the writings of R.L. Wilson. His works were generally very visual and didn't always dig in. There were also claims that he was an outright fraud, as Wilson also traded in the arms that he was describing, and his writings may have been self-serving. More recently, some lovely work has been done by men like Charles W. Pate. I greatly enjoyed his work on the Colt Walker, and his book on the Colt 1860 has also included some valuable references to other models, helped very much in this episode. These books, along with writings by Herbert Houze, who I also trust very much, form the backbone of our narrative today. However, neither of them particularly specialized in telling the story of the Dragoon, and so I'm quite certain I'm going to have to one day revisit this topic because there are gaps. But for now, I'm going to construct the best known story I can for you all, and with that asterisk in place, let's start at the beginning with this guy right here, a reproduction, an approximation of an early Dragoon revolver, which was very similar to its immediate precursor, the Colt Walker. This was the topic of our last episode of Reprocussion, but given the close relationship to our gun today, we'll do a brief review. The first Colt revolver had been, about a decade sooner and half the weight. It hadn't gone as well. This left Sam Colt out of the gun business for several years, up until 1846, which is when the outbreak of the Mexican-American War saw him diving back into firearms design in an attempt to cash in on the obvious demand. Taking constructive criticism from one Samuel Walker, noted Texas Ranger, the pair would create a monstrous cavalry weapon. Almost 16 inches long and weighing 4.5 pounds, this .44 caliber 6-shooter could fit 60 grains of powder in each chamber, although some were liable to split under that load. In January of 1847, the US government would purchase 1,000 Colt Walker revolvers at a price of $28 each. The only problem? Colt didn't own a factory anymore. He had long ago lost his Patterson concern and so had to work with famed manufacturer Eli Whitney in order to produce his guns. Now, Whitney had finished manufacture of the 1,000 Walker revolvers by the end of July 1847, and even as that was wrapping up, Sam Colt was already sending letters. On July 6th of 1847, he wrote to the Secretary of War William L. Marcy, stating that the first contract for revolvers was complete and requesting a second. Marcy requested pricing and Colt offered up several options. He also told something of a lie. My workmen are well instructed and will leave me unless I have immediate inducements to keep them together. It would be difficult to replace them. I say this was a lie because as far back as May, there were letters between Sam Colt and his brother James discussing the possibility of establishing a factory in collaboration with Samuel Hawken of St. Louis. The letters between the Colts and Hawken give us some glimpse into the financials. At least I think so. Here's the problem. Sam Colt was basically a damned liar. And so when certain parties asked about his profits from the first government contract, he repeatedly stated that he had not made any material profit on the first 1,000 Walker pistols. When trying to induce Hawken, however, he estimated the cost of each Walker in the first year of production to be $10 a piece. Assuming a contract for 5,000 more units, this would fall to $8 in production costs each. The sale price would be $25, meaning a very tidy profit. Ultimately, Colt and Hawken would not partner up, and through letters we can see him hedging his bets by scratching out letters to others like Blunt and Sims. What he really wanted, though, was his own factory once more. This time, unlike the previous Patterson concern, he was going to keep majority control. Unlike the Patterson days, Sam Colt of 1847 had an existing Marshall contract to use as sort of a financial leverage point. And this did go a long way in getting family and closer friends, more ardent believers, into investing. However, no one wants to double down on a one-hit wonder, and so a second contract would be really the cornerstone of his trying to leverage for his own company. Thankfully, Marcy would soon concede and promise Colt a second contract in a letter arriving later in July of 1847. And on that basis, Colt would begin his work in earnest. By July 29th, he writes that he has commenced preparations for manufacturing the next lot of pistols, and that the encouragement had induced him to establish an armory in Hartford, Connecticut. Well, the race was now on because the war couldn't last forever. Colt had to get a factory up and running in just a few months' time. He was, in theory, aided by his contract with Whitney, in which he was entitled to the specific machinery, tooling, and excess parts from the manufacturer of the first contract. Unfortunately, this was all due to him on completion of the order, which in Whitney's world meant after the guns were accepted and paid for by the US government. Just because they finished manufacture in July, that doesn't mean the US had accepted the guns right away. They had to be proof-fired, which had an attrition rate nearing 20% at that time, meaning they'd have to remanufacture those particular pistols into working service again, then proof-fire them again. Also, Colt's prior antics were coming back to bite him, and it all had to do with, well, actually, something that looks a lot like this, the Walker flask. Well, this is a reproduction thereof, which was also used on the early Dragoon revolvers. So let's get a look at what I'm talking about. Now, like everything else in this series, I cannot afford an original, so this is a reproduction. In this case, it is actually sort of a middling reproduction between the two patterns that, as far as I'm aware, that we know of. But let's take a look real quick. We have a spout, we have a little cover here that we'll see in a minute, and then we have the body of the flask, two little swivels to attach it to a piece of leather or string to hang over your shoulder, and then, of course, this beautiful embossing. Now, as far as I am aware, and again, I did not get to dig deep into the accessories market, and there's also a lot of, well, to be honest, there's a lot of arguing about what the accessories market should be. But to our understanding, the very original version of these, the actual Walker version of these, the embossing was very sharp and clean to the point that these two little pistols down here were very, very clearly Walkers. Then, when the next 500 were made, theoretically, or perhaps even beyond that, they didn't use the same dye method, or they made a new dye, and these ended up getting very murky, and they just look like pistols generically. As far as I've been able to see from photographs, this is somewhere in between. So the resolution on these is a little sharper than, say, the later pattern, and it's a little duller than the first pattern, at least as far as has been explored. It's a rare accessory. There's not a lot of examples to look at, so there you go. Also, they could have been found either embossed on both sides or just on the one side, and to be honest with you, at the moment, I can't recall which was supposed to have come first, but this embossing as a whole is very indicative of Colt's theory of low effort, high quality. So it's really only one extra machine step, because you'd have like a die that you'd press into the body of this before assembling it, before soldering it together, right? Well, that's not a lot of extra effort, especially in sort of this new industrial era. But to the average consumer at that time, it would have looked like a lot of extra effort, right? This is very fancy compared to most of the things that they're encountering, and yet it didn't take a lot of work. So that sort of low effort, high fancy is a thing that we see in Colt and Colt accessories that does a lot to sort of set them apart from other manufacturers in the era and make people feel like they're getting their values worth. This is very strong marketing, is what this is. So, also, I mean, look at it. It makes it look, Colt looks American and prestigious as all get out with this, right? Remember, this is a brand new arms company to most people, and yet this looks established, right? This is smart, all right? Now, let's talk about the actual mechanism of the flask, which, let me change the camera a bit. At the top, we have two doohickeys. The first is the spout, which is adjustable and pre-measured. So the way this would work is that you can actually take this and thread or unthread this. Now, I've looked at originals. They seem to be of the same construction in photographs. I have not handled one, but it appears to be the same way it works, which is that this is actually a threaded rod that goes down into the flask. We'll pull it out in a second. You can turn this in or out to adjust how much powder is going to pre-collect in this tube section. And then when you push this into the chamber of the revolver, it's going to dump just that fixed amount of powder. Again, slightly adjustable to the user. The other thing that's on the front of this is a little hatch, which if we open, we'll see we have some lead ball in there. In this case, it fits 644, which is exactly one reload for the gun. Again, we're working with a reproduction and assuming it's just like the original, but let's go ahead and open up this mechanism. Now I have powder in here, so there might be a little mess, but we have this, we have this cylinder, and it has an opening right about here. Let me get my patented plastic and pokey. There we go. Right there, we've got a little opening. And that allows it, when it's in the flask and the flask is turned upside down, it allows this guy to fill up this lower section, and it's stopped right about the top of this opening. So when we push the plunger, as the plunger starts letting powder out, it also cuts off the availability of powder from the reservoir of the flask, which means chunk, only what was in this chamber is going to be able to fall into the chamber of the revolver. And so by adjusting this little plunger up and down, which you see is a threaded rod all the way at the rear, we'll be able to control how much would pre-fill in here, and therefore how much would dispense at the moment of opening. This is ingenious in construction, but it was generally not favored. It tended to throw irregular loads, and therefore would affect the precision of the firearm. Not necessarily the accuracy, that's up to the shooter, but if you're throwing slightly different loads, and especially if you're shooting out beyond, 40 yards, and a lot of people tried to do that with these revolvers, and boy am I struggling to get this in here. Nice, there we go. Then obviously you're not going to want to rely on this particular guy. At the same time, the fact that he's screwed in like this and he has this pre-measured push and all that means that you don't have what would have been a fairly handy fixed spout that you could just throw a thumb over, pre-fill, and then go, which to most people probably would have been a little bit friendlier and easier in that time period. The early Dragoons would also share the original Walker combination tool. So you have a nipple wrench, you have a flat screwdriver head for getting at the screws, and then you have this unusual U shape, which was actually meant to allow you to compress the mainspring on a disassembled gun. And to be frank, US Ordnance hated these because they tended to gouge the grips of the gun, because you would have to leverage, the grip here as this is compressing the spring. It was really fiddly, and it was not good for the firearm as a whole, but it was cheap and easy to make, and it fulfilled Colt's contractual obligations. It would take a while for anyone to realize how terrible this thing was, and in the meantime, they still needed to load the dang guns. When Walker and Colt had begun this venture, they had planned for a pair of pistols for each cavalryman. But the price of each singular Colt was nearly 4 times the cost of a single-shot horse pistol, meaning a pair of them was just too hefty a sum. Ordnance believed that if the gun was a 6-shooter, it was already 3 times better than, well, the 2 single-shot pistols, so 1 would do. Just one problem, Walker had initially contracted for only 500 flasks and 500 combination tools for 1,000 pistols, and it was a little fuzzy if the government agreed knowingly. The matter would be prosecuted by Assistant Chief of Ordnance and basically Acting Chief of Ordnance George Talcott. Born in Glastonbury, Connecticut in December of 1786, Talcott was born to a farming family. In 1813, he entered the infantry as a 3rd lieutenant, and within a matter of weeks made 2nd lieutenant. By August of the same year, he had been transferred to the Ordnance Department and promoted to 1st lieutenant. Roughly 5 weeks later, he was offered captaincy in the 41st Infantry, which he declined, and almost immediately afterward accepted captaincy in the Ordnance Corps. He commanded the arsenal in New York City, and then in Albany. In May of 1814, he reverted back to a 1st lieutenant. Honestly, it's giving me whiplash just trying to keep up with his service record. Next, he was assigned to the new Watertown Arsenal in Massachusetts, which was constructed under his supervision. He commanded there for a while before moving to the Allegheny Arsenal near Pittsburgh. I'm going to be honest, folks, this goes on for a while. It's like pachinko with this guy, and we don't need all the details. I do want to hit some high notes though, because they may relate to our story for this episode and the next. In 1824, Talcott was in command when a deserter escaped from the post stockade. He had the man horsewhipped, which was outside regulations. Talcott faced charges of abuse, but was found not guilty of illegal and unmilitary conduct. The adjutant general so disliked this, he actually ordered him retried, but the new court agreed with the first court. By 1833, Talcott had risen to lieutenant colonel and was made an inspector of arsenals and armories. In 1839, he became the acting chief of Ordnance Bureau, and in 1842, he was appointed assistant chief of ordnance. The actual chief was George Bomford at the time, but Talcott immediately took to sort of running the place in his stead. By the time of our story, Bomford was largely out of the picture in terms of actually running his department. Talcott would officially take on the title of chief after Bomford's death in 1848. Though the title changed little in his relationship with Sam Colt, which was acrimonious at best. Talcott was not a fan of Colt's revolvers. He considered them expensive and delicate. He also really didn't want to issue them 2 at a time and demanded the 500 extra accessories, the flasks and tools, before he would accept the remaining walkers. He would also threaten to cancel the 2nd contract, which would end up being our gun today. In the end, though, the government would have to pay additional money to get their additional 500 accessories. Just one problem. Colt hadn't kept up on his payments to everyone around him, and was struggling to re-engage the flask maker. Other plans had to be made, which not only took time, but apparently kept falling apart. In the end, the accessories would not be ready until February of 1848. Even as all this was shaking out, Colt was shaking down the Whitneyville Armory. He was looting guns, tools, and even employees in a desperate bid to set up his own company. Financially, he would find some major backing from his cousin, Elijah Colt. In exchange for $500 cash and a line of credit to not exceed $14,000, Sam Colt would sign over rights, title, and interest to the 2nd contract. Elijah, like Whitney before, was to receive the government payments directly until all liabilities were covered. Sam also had to insure his business assets and give the policy to cousin Elijah. Smart man. Sam Colt continued to spend the summer and fall sneaking in and out of Whitneyville, and it shows in his letters. In August alone, he was asked to return a pulley necessary to operate one of the drilling machines, and he had not returned the cutting tools for making the locking wedges and their corresponding holes. These were still necessary at Whitneyville because, again, they were still producing replacement guns from the failed, proof tests from US inspection and eventually acceptance. Luckily for Colt, Whitney had managed to push the government into accepting the final 500 Walker revolvers by early September of 1847, which is when the financial disputes really kicked into gear between Whitney and Colt. Ultimately, they both had to turn to lawyers who produced a variety of inventories, no 2 of which ever seemed to reconcile. In all of this, the flask maker also sued Sam Colt for lack of payment. Oh boy. Ultimately, everything would be slowly ironed out, and somehow Sam Colt kept enough coin in his purse to keep on working on his new factory mission. He would lease 2 adjoining buildings at 33 Pearl Street in Hartford in early August 1847, which is where he was piling up his spoils from Whitneyville. The Pearl Street factory would also be the home to his brief period of experimentation and improvement over the original Walker. As we saw in our last Reprocussion episode, that Walker is a massive piece of iron, which, while intimidating, did have a few glaring problems. It's important to remember, by the way, that despite some inspection woes, at this point in time the Walkers had not made it to the front lines. They wouldn't arrive in Texas and on, the battlefield until October of 1847, and we're still in August/September. So its replacement was being designed without battlefield experience. After the dust settled, however, Colt did give credit to one then Captain William Anderson Thornton for his input. Born in Albany, New York in 1802, Thornton graduated West Point in 1825 with the rank of second lieutenant in the artillery. He was a member of the Black Hawk expedition in 1832 and served at Charleston Harbor alongside Winfield Scott during the nullification crisis. His first ordnance posting was at the Watervliet Arsenal again in 1833. From here he had various postings, rising to captain in 1838 and head of the New York Ordnance Depot and inspector of contract arms in 1840. Which is where he intersects with our story today. Having inspected the contract walkers, Thornton was well aware of the inherent problems. Most notable was the severe weight, the poor handling from its massive size, and the oversized chambers made it possible to load enough powder to burst the cylinders on nearly 20% of the guns made. And finally, the loading lever wasn't entirely secure, and when it fell, it would jam the action. So by October of 1847, Sam Colt had now taken as many as 45 whole Walker revolvers, several hundred frames, barrels, and cylinders from Whitneyville, and he had begun tinkering with solutions to the same problems that Ordnance saw. We can see signs of his work as early as October 4th, when he sent 2 pistols to the Secretary of the Navy. One of these revolvers had been fitted by request with a belt clip. What he gave them, however, wasn't the Walker you see now. Colt's letter stated that the new pistol would be about 9 inches long from the bottom of the chamber to the muzzle. That represented a barrel shortening of 1.5 inches from the original. The barrel lug was also cut back, which reduced weight and improved handling. He would be changing the grip straps, previously made of iron, into brass, again shedding weight. He kept the Walker's frame, likely because of his existing tooling, but he did shorten the cylinder 1/4 inch. Yes, once more ditching weight, but also now reducing the maximum possible charge of powder, thus preventing the bursting that we saw in the earlier gun. Small problem though, the oversized frame left a gap, so the barrel was projected rearward. Bonus, this provided more clearance for loading bullets instead of just round ball. The loading lever on this model is a bit of a mystery because the one known example was modified at a later date after being returned to Colt. In his letter, he said that he would use an iron ram and small rod in place of an attached lever, which would reduce the weight about 3/4 of a pound. Now the purpose of all of this, according to Colt, was to have the revolver fit a then standard service pistol holster. Now that would likely mean one fitted for the 1842 single-shot percussion pistol, which was a fairly large handgun but still smaller than the previous Walker and certainly much lighter. Before the Navy even received their sample revolver, Sam Colt had already changed his mind, though, about that detached loading tool set. He wrote the very next day after his first letter, suggesting a spring hook for retaining the loading lever. Clearly, he was struggling to keep the lever on the gun, and yet somehow permanently out of the way. On October 22nd, he would proudly write to the Secretary of War that he had an even better solution, which he would include on the second contract pistols. This was a spring-loaded plunger in the lever itself, which engaged a tab attached to the barrel. Now we put all that together and we get what collectors call the first model Dragoon revolver, which is so similar to the Walker that many don't consider it to be a distinctly different model from the Walker, and that the subsequent changes are more significant, and I'll get into those in a moment. Now because Colt mostly did this work by modifying existing Walker parts and occasionally creating new ones, there are a number of transitional pistols with various, levels of quality. But none of them were sold in contract to the government. That would be saved until he actually started, factory assembly of a new model, which would turn out to be the improved holster model. Now, that is what most people consider to be the first Dragoon. This reproduction right here is mostly modeled on a first Dragoon with some differences that I will happily point out. So let's go ahead and get a closer look. All right, we have our Walker. And we have our quote-unquote first pattern of Dragoon. Now, both of these are reproductions. This one a Colt second generation. This one, I'm unsure of the manufacturer. It has Italian proofs, but I wasn't able to get a maker's name on it. It seems to be a fairly old pattern, and there's some well, there's some problems with this one, but it's working for our episode today. Now, let's talk about one thing, which is that this Colt 2nd generation has a blued cylinder. It should have been in the white in order to be authentic to the original Walker. I haven't done that change on my gun. I apologize, but imagine it's in the white. This is also in the white. So, what have we got in common? Well, obviously, they're in the same family of firearms because, I mean, really, it looks like a length issue. And to be honest with you, that's kind of about it. We have, in terms of similarity, the same exact bore, same 44 cartridge chambering, same percussion nipple setup, and they're Colt nipples, which were a thing. Yeah, he designed a shape for inside this sort of flash hole. And then hammer assembly, trigger assembly, internal action, all the same. The grip straps, in terms of milling and fit, all the same. The frame itself is literally identical. The only thing really on the back half of these guns that is different is that originally the Colt Walkers would have had an iron backstrap. This reproduction, I believe, is using steel. The Dragoons would have had a brass backstrap, which is correct on this particular reproduction. They used the same V-spring internally, and no roller on the hammer. We'll talk more about that later. On the cylinders, outer diameter, stops, everything's the same except for the length. So the cylinder was reduced slightly in length. We can see that as it plays out in the roll engraving, in which we have sort of this cloud cover part of the Ormsby engraving. This is an Indian fight scene, by the way, off the Walker. You can see that in an episode on the Walker. The exact same roll engraving was used on this gun, but of course now our clouds have kind of disappeared, and these big banners for, you know, model and marking, model USMR, US Mounted Rifleman at that time, patent Colts. This is sort of getting almost cut off by the fact that this has been reduced slightly. Doing this, of course, allowed Colt to prevent excessive charges from being loaded into the guns. And then because of that change, we see sort of the first change to the front of the gun, which is that if the frame is the same length on both guns, but you've cut back the cylinder, then you have to extend the barrel rearward past this barrel lug, or this sort of half Knox form that the barrel rests in that forms the front half of the revolver. So this guy, what would be sort of the forcing cone area of the gun, is much longer than this one, which is very tight on the Walker. This had an added benefit of giving you more clearance in which to do your loading on the gun. So if I flip this guy over, we have a half cut for being able to load like a large pointed bullet into this. So there was a Dragoon bullet. Being able to load that, we have more clearance because of this extra gap as well than we would have had on the Walker. So let me get these guys out and flipped around actually. So you notice on the Walker, there has to be much more cut away in order to get that deep bullet in there. We have a nice little shallow cut here. That means we have room for, well, technically, if we were using the same Knox form, we would have room for more metal, but because of that savings, they could go ahead and reduce this down. So we have less material in here. And then for the whole length, some of that material has been removed as well, and the loading rod set back just a little bit closer. This little plunger is going to be shorter then, and that reduces a big chunk of metal over here that was present on the Walker. That's a lot of weight savings. On these reproductions, with it being steel, modern steel, it's not a huge difference, but on the originals, oh yeah, that would have saved you a fair bit of poundage. Well, maybe not a whole pound, but still, that's some good weight. Ounces add up, right? Now, the rods themselves have also changed. On the Walker, you have, let me get this out of the way. You have sort of a hook retaining spring that is inevitably going to wear out. Ours is still in very good condition, so it snaps too, but that can only go through so many iterations. On this particular gun, well, we have a little bit of a problem, so let me zoom in. The new release system is a plunger and hook, so if we pull this back, we'll see there is a ledge here, and of course a lug off the bottom of the barrel. By the way, this is now shortened from the Walker. There's a lug here with a little catch that connects with what is actually a shaped plunger. So this is a hook, and it is also a plunger with a spring down inside the tube. So if I push on this, you'll see it retract all together, one big plunger. Now, the reason I had to zoom in is because I'm kind of lying to you at the moment. This is a different version of a Dragoon revolver that we're using in the next episode. This is the one we're shooting today, and I just wanted to really show you guys how confusing it can be for the guys doing the reproductions, because this I've never seen before on any other brand. They set this up as a teeter-totter, and it actually threw me for a loop. So you have to push forward in order for it to go back, and then it comes down. And as a matter of fact, it's so stiff in this configuration that you can't shove it closed, which on an original or on other reproductions you're likely to see, you can actually just snap it back into place. So if I take this out and then I go to put it up, it just clicks on in. It's nice and friendly. I have no idea who made this or why they did it that way. It's frankly bizarre. Having looked at it myself, if anybody's curious on the reproduction front, this is a teeter-totter with a plunger and spring behind it, which is an extra part, by the way, so that's neat. All right, that does it for our comparison. Let me set this aside. Of course, just like the Walker, by the way, it's a single action only, so we're in the half cock now for being able to set our caps and load through the front of the chambers. You guys should know that from last episode. The half cock serves as sort of a safety position on the original Walkers, but there's something I want to talk about that in the next episode. I'm going to briefly mention it here, which is that, yes, especially on these guys, we have the ability to rest the hammer. Let me show you that real quick. Having loaded and capped the firearm, you can get to a middle position between the nipples, or the firing cones, as some would say, and you can let that hammer down and then snug it in. And what's happened now is there's a little projection on the back of the cylinder that is fitting into a notch in the hammer so that the gun can no longer rotate until you recock the hammer. So even if you have a situation in which you're bouncing along in the saddle and this is really getting sprung, you're gonna need to have it spring all the way back past the half cock, all the way back to almost full cock in order to get it indexed far enough to catch a nipple. And then when it falls, it's probably gonna catch in half cock again. It makes it very, very difficult and unlikely to ever get this gun to accidentally discharge when you're in this position, which means you have the effect of your full 5 shots, no having to rest on an empty. We did not talk about this feature in the previous episode, and I'm not gonna go into detail on this one because it's actually under a patent that comes later, so we're gonna see more about this in the next episode. Now, I will say we've only really covered external changes. Mechanically, the only thing significantly different, of course, was the change to the plunger. Internally, not much. However, there were manufacturing shifts, let's say. So instead of like blind tapping a screw hole, they would bore through and tap it. There were also little ways that he would chase the frame, things like that, that would make it faster to produce the gun, more efficient to produce the gun. But in terms of the springs, the sears, they're all exactly the same as we saw on the Walker, this guy right here. So, since we already did an episode on this, there's really no value in making a slightly different animation when they work exactly the same. So if you'd like to know the internals of, say, the very first model, go check out the Walker episode. Now, next time we're gonna see an animation of the changes that did occur later in this gun, but for today, let's just get the story started. Now, as part of that, I think, since we're skipping the animation, we can probably get this straight into Mae's hand and allow her to shoot the pistol.
First, we'll set the gun to the half-cock. And I'll make use of the stand in order to keep the camera lined up. Using the Walker and Dragoon flask, we'll shake it a bit to fill the inner tube, then depress and shake to empty it. The charge should be correct, although this thing is awkward and seems to be making a mess. From here, I'll load up lead bullet. Special thanks to Ergonomics bullet molds for the help, by the way. Now, in previous episodes, we've tried a number of modern loading considerations, notably felt wads and greasing the chamber muzzles. Neither were historically accurate, and honestly, that grease was a pointless mess. But we wanted to work through all the suggestions out there, as this series is also about the hobby of black powder loading. Today, we're doing it the old-fashioned way, powder, then lead. So, when pressing in the bullet, make sure it cuts a nice ring, meaning it's sealed well against flashover. Now, this reproduction has an unusual lever latch, which required more fiddling than usual to keep out of my way and to release. Overall, leverage was fairly poor, and I'm really having to drive down on this guy to guarantee there isn't an extra air gap behind the bullet. Also, if the bullet isn't deep enough, it will jam the action on rotation. With all 6 chambers loaded, we can start capping. Each of these percussion caps are coated inside with priming compound. A blow from the hammer, and we get a lovely spark with our powder. Since I've loaded the gun up fully, I'll make use of one of the safety pins set between the nipples.
It is actually a little bit of a stiff hammer on this particular reproduction. Sorry, Mae. With his own manufacturer nearly in swing and with his model decided on, Sam Colt was able to officially sign his contract with the US government on November 2nd of 1847. Just to be clear, this was now his second contract overall and the first for what we'll much later call the Dragoon pistol. 1,000 more revolvers, now for $25 each. Sam would finalize his contracts with his workmen on November 30th. These were primarily for 1,000 units of various necessary components for assembly. But they also included terms for assembling firearms from, well, essentially leftovers. That tells us 2 things are very likely. 1, Colt was using up surplus from the Walker contract and any surpluses from the new contract in order to then make and sell civilian arms. And 2, because he ordered 1,000 of every critical part, the government guns were made from scratch without the use of any significant parts from the previous Walkers or from Whitneyville. Production in earnest likely began in December, but it would take time to get the whole guns together, and Colt still wanted to push for more government contracts anyway, so he had to send out samples made up of hybrid components. One recipient would be the senator from Texas, Thomas Jefferson Rusk. A firm Colt supporter, Rusk would advocate for his revolvers. Writing in December of 1847, Rusk requested a sample pistol for exhibition to the military committees of the 2 houses. Colt sent along a modified Walker, which at some point apparently burst. Curiously, no one seems to have written down when, so I'm unsure if it was while on display or many years later. Colt and his workmen would keep at it through the winter, taking our story into February of 1848, which is when Captain Thornton finally received the additional 500 powder flasks and other accessories for the second batch of Walker revolvers. Sending along a letter to Talcott, he also mentioned that Samuel Colt's next batch of 1,000 pistols were not the same as those original Walkers. This was news to Talcott, who in turn wrote to Colt stating that he would need a sample pistol submitted for inspection and approval by his office before they could possibly inspect and accept any of the 1,000 now in production. Also, during the month of March, Talcott would be promoted to colonel and became the actual chief of Ordnance. Sam Colt would see him personally in Washington, hoping to move this inspection process along much more quickly, and likely still trying to pitch more sales of his revolver to Congress. But Talcott stalled. He wanted the Secretary of War to make the final call. Marcy, however, was bedridden with illness, and it wouldn't be until April of 1848 that Talcott finally sent Colt a letter of approval for the improved pistol. Unfortunately for Colt, this long delay meant that he had exhausted his tailwind. The Mexican-American War was largely over, with the fighting all but done back in February, and the official treaty was ratified in May. Still, Colt delivered his 1,000 pistols in lots of several hundred at a time from June until November of 1848. Now, this might have well been the last of his major sales in the US if not for some bullheadedness and some luck. First, Samuel Colt shored up his defenses. In October of 1848, he managed to get a reissue of his 1836 patent 12 years after the fact. This was on the grounds that he had not been able to materially benefit from its protection over the previous, well over a decade. Amazingly, he was now still able to protect his core revolving design, a massive barrier against what should have been the now emerging competition for the next 7 years. And the luck? Well, even as the year 1848 was winding down, the soon-to-be gold rush was just starting. The precious metal had been discovered in Sutter's Mill, California way back in January, but it took time for word to travel and for people to realize just how much of it there was out there to hopefully be discovered. The matter came to the direct attention of Washington by December of 1848, and it was soon apparent that the West would be seeing a massive change as hordes of people struck out in hopes of striking it rich. This would, of course, bring more friction with the native peoples and perhaps inspire more civil unrest. The US Army would need to be present, and according to Colt, they deserved the best weapons possible for these trying times. 5,000 at least, but it should be 10,000 to be sure. So our hero once again set about writing letters. He petitioned congressmen and the president, pointing out massive orders for private arms and submitting 70 letters of endorsement for his revolver. These came from officers and men of distinction in war and politics. And despite all his efforts, the opinion of one man still stood firmly in his way. Talcott, who on December 21st of 1848 had sent a fresh review of Colt's pistols, judged from the devastated Walkers we mentioned in our last episode. I'm going to be honest, they had not fared well in service, bursting, breaking, or falling to pieces over a very short period of warfare. However, some people theorized that only the worst of them were actually turned back in, while the rest were secreted away or outright bought by the soldiers carrying them. Better to pay for the lost pistol fee and keep the gun than try to find a way to order basically an unobtainium revolver in the private market at that time. But Talcott did not see it that way. The capacity of continuous fire is an advantage greatly overrated. In special cases, such a weapon may be advantageous, but it will be found that this will be the case with individuals, not of large bodies. Oh man, it is 1848 and I'm already hearing the same old argument that we always hear in the area of early magazine loading rifles. Talcott's refusal of the Colt stuck firm and stymied Sam's salesmanship, but he wasn't without friends in high places. Colt's biggest advocates at this time were, as expected, Texans. The aforementioned Rusk and now U.S. Senator Samuel Houston, who both met directly with Secretary of War William Marcy on December 27. Apparently, their discussion became heated as Marcy fervently backed Talcott's opinion, apparently to the point of rudeness. Rusk would actually write to Colt, "I saw that politeness and reason were all lost upon him, and I did not measure very carefully what I said to him." For the time and Rusk's stature, that must have been quite the argument. Both the Texans and Colt would also petition the president directly, but he said it was a congressional matter, so Russ could file a joint resolution to purchase 5,000 Colt revolvers at $23 apiece. This actually managed to pass in the Senate, but stalled in the House. However, around the same time, pressure was bubbling up from below. Then, Colonel William Selby Harney was in command of the U.S. 2nd Dragoons, that's mounted infantry, although the U.S. was American about it. Harney had seen the Colt revolvers firsthand and wanted them for his regiment. Well, the second contract of 1,000 revolvers, the first of our model today, was marked USMR, US Mounted Rifles, just like the Dragoons before. Harney wanted his guns marked for the Dragoons and put in a request for 1,230 of the things. This was endorsed back in August of 1848, long before the ongoing fight over a 5,000 or 10,000 unit order. Harney's request would be reduced down to 1,000 pistols, and the contract was used as a sort of political olive branch, one that took the expensive 5,000 unit order out of the US Congress in favor of just a straight 1,000 unit order through the authority of the Secretary of War, Marcy. The order was authorized on January 8, 1849, $25 apiece for each gun and accessories. Talcott wrote to Sam Colt on the matter on January 10th. He wanted another production sample for inspection, likely at this point believing Sam Colt would change the guns whenever he felt like it. This time, the revolvers were to be marked for the US Dragoons, and the cylinders should now be blued. Alright, before we get too far down the rabbit hole, let's take a break for a second, because by the time this 1849 contract was delivered, some more changes were to work their way into this revolver here. And if you can't tell, this is already getting to be kind of a long story, and it's Sam Colt, so I have a whole lot more to say about him. Before we go any further, let's talk about how these guys were initially issued out. The first batch of 1,000 improved model Colts were held in storage until February of 1849, at which point they were sent along to the St. Louis Arsenal to be issued to the Regiment of Mounted Riflemen. This cavalry regiment would take their revolvers along for a 2,000-mile journey west, riddled with difficulties, most of them related to supply and transport. Can't shoot your way out of that. They would arrive in the Oregon Territory just in time for the fervor of the gold rush. Apparently, a great number of men simply deserted and took their Colt revolvers with them as they struck out south for California and dreams of riches. Interestingly, writings from the time reveal those guns could be worth, well, their weight in gold. Writing in 1850, Lieutenant W. Mae of the U.S. Navy would say, "During my residence in California from April to November of 1849, Colt's repeating pistol was in great demand. I saw many of them sold for $150 for the large size and $100 for the small pistol." I'll talk more about that small pistol later. Just for those of you who aren't good at counting at home, that's 6 times the contract price. Now, back east, the Colt revolvers were selling quickly, so Sam didn't rush quite so much for the contract this time. Deliveries would be carried out from October until January, again in batches of several hundred. That meant that Harney and his men would have to wait. It wouldn't be until the end of April 1850 that the order was given to swap the old Walkers for the new Dragoon pistols. Alright, we'll talk more next episode about Samuel Colt and his improved holster revolver. There will be travel and changes, contracts and innovations, sort of. Before all that though, there's an inconsistency that's been bothering me. Collectors readily call the Model 1847 revolver the Walker, for Samuel Walker's input on its design. The Dragoon is nicknamed for the change in the cylinder marking, which only came during the second contract of this particular pistol. Before that, it was really just an improved Walker, and both Colt and Talcott put credit for that improvement on William Thornton. Maybe we should be calling it more properly the Colt Thornton. No, I guess it doesn't have the same ring though. To Samuel Colt, this was probably still just a Walker pistol in his mind, and there's some evidence to that point actually. In November of 1847, right at the start of production, he is quoted as saying, "I can furnish a few of the 6-chambered holster pistols of my construction at this time called the Walker model," spelling as was. At the time, he might have had some Walkers on hand, but 6 together for sale in a consistent pattern? I suspect he was referring to this guy right here and still considered it to be the Walker. Now, whether or not he continued to think that way, even after some more significant changes we'll see in our next episode, well, that's to be decided. For now, though, let's get Mae's opinion on the first pattern, talk more too on that, Dragoon Revolver. Once more, we've made room for Mae.
Hello.
And through trials and tribulations, we have a reasonable facsimile of a first pattern Colt Dragoon / improved holster model.
Yes.
Let me give you this.
I'm not gonna lie, this honestly just looks like a Walker. Just a little slightly scaled down version of a Walker.
Yes. I mean, if we look, it
literally is.
Yeah. Although it's not scaled down, it's very specific things. They've cut back the barrel.
Right.
They've cut back what you might call this lug or Knox form up here at the front.
Yep, and the cylinder a little bit too. It's not quite as massive.
But they kept the exact same frame and grip and everything else. Mm-hmm. And the lock work was the same, which is very critical because essentially that is a Walker, almost like a lot of armies would consider it an officer's model. You know what I mean? Where you've just sort of shrunk up some stuff.
Made it a little bit easier for the officer, sure.
Yeah, but that's not how we used it, of course. But it's the same idea, is that the general construction is there and you've just shortened some things up, right? Mm-hmm. So like a Revolver with a slightly shorter barrel is a officer's version of the Revolver.
Right.
Know? So you're kind of in that realm. At least as far as it goes, this is the first pattern. After this, some things change. We're going to have another episode, obviously.
Right.
But before we get going too far into it, I do want to say, repercussion can be very difficult to make.
Yeah, not just, as me as the shooter, definitely so, because we have to make sure that we get the shots just perfect. And the problem is with black powder here in the South, with the humidity and the rain, you have to really dance around that here.
Yeah. And then it's like, are we using Pyrodex so we can see the gun better? Are we using black powder so we get the plume, but then we can't see anything?
Right, it just
Can we get the black powder? Yeah.
Oh my God.
So on top of all that, the research, like I already said at the beginning of this episode, was frankly not great.
Right.
It's very difficult to figure out who's saying what about Colt revolvers. Please, ladies and gentlemen, I often see people repeating me as gospel and getting into fights. I'm just telling you the best version of what I could find. Mm-hmm. I don't have ego in it. I don't consider myself to be a person who knows everything at all.
Oh, God, no.
I just know whatever has been handed down or researched by others because I have to do a show every other week. I don't get to do a lot of primary research.
And then from there, you have to consolidate what you have been able to pull together into some sort of storyline that previously wasn't there.
I think we have the best resolution on the story I've told so far. Mm-hmm. The next episode we have is where it gets a little weird.
Hinky, okay.
Yeah. So let's trust this one as much as we can.
Okay.
On top of it all, though, we also now have to put one more caveat, which is specific to the Reprocussion series, which is that this is a reproduction. As a matter of fact, this is a reproduction from a manufacturer that I haven't identified.
That's true. We don't officially know.
Yeah, we saw earlier, this gun does not even have the correct latching mechanism on it. Mm-hmm. So, big grain of salt when we compare, or big grain of salt when we compare, because both of these guns are made with more modern steel, more modern materials, and they're made as reproductions of the originals. They're not the same thing. So, with all that in mind, at least it's fair that we're comparing two reproductions.
That's true. Yeah, we're not comparing original to repro. That would be different.
Right. With all that in mind, how are the ergonomics on this first pattern Dragoon coming from the Walker?
Well, like I said, this pretty much feels like just a scaled down version of the Walker. It's a little bit lighter, barely so, but you definitely notice. I wish we'd had the time and the ability and had both guns there to be able to shoot one immediately after the other. But of course, with our shooting schedule, it doesn't always work out that way. We don't always have both options to shoot at the same time. But you definitely can tell when you hold them next together a significant poundage difference. Like maybe half a pound or something like that.
Well, according to our measurements between these two reproductions, of just about half a pound.
Yeah, okay. That's about right.
The originals, the claims were stronger, but I haven't sat there and taken a survey of weights between them, so I'm not 100% sure there.
Fair.
But it's not just that it's half a pound, but it's a half a pound off the front of the gun.
Right, so I'm not having to hold up nearly as much. I want to say my hand definitely was not shaking nearly as badly.
Will you take, let's go with the Walker first.
Okay.
Will you put this out to full extension and just sort of give us maybe a 5-second count to yourself? There we go. I'm seeing some shaking already. I know that you're not locked out, but that's feeling a little... Okay. And then we'll do the same thing again, just like a nice little internal 5-second count. Now you're tired from the first one, but I'm just not quite seeing as much deviation.
No, it's definitely not as bad.
Where do you feel it in your hand when you're pointing that way?
I feel most of it, honestly, resting right here on my middle finger, because my middle finger goes right here behind the trigger guard.
Okay.
So effectively that's holding it up. And then I'm feeling it right back here in my forearm, trying to hold it.
Now when you hold the Walker, is it any different to you? Let's see. Because I have an opinion here. I want to see if Mae feels the same way as I do.
No, it pretty much is the same deal. It's same right there on the middle finger.
See, for me, when I hold the Walker and I extend it, I notice that I feel a lot of pressure back here at the heel. And it feels like I have a lot of steering pressure back there. Like I'm kind of almost controlling the gun. And I mean, it's normal to control the gun between your heel and your middle finger.
You know, that could be because
I'm really feeling it in the heel.
Your hand probably goes further down than mine does. If you notice, mine actually doesn't even go down to the bottom base of the grip. Does yours?
I believe so. Let me see. A little lower, yes, and I'm definitely steering it right about here.
So I think
which
you're
is where
feeling
the
it
bell
more,
begins.
right?
So to me, I'm controlling a lot of the gun from the heel, and I'm feeling a lot of pressure right here, like sharp pressure right here. And I know it's not a ton of weight difference, but this gun has a materially softer feel at the back of my hand here.
I personally can't feel the difference. I think it's just because I can't reach that far down with my hand.
Does it feel steadier at least?
It definitely does. Less shaking. It doesn't feel quite as difficult to hold it up longer, that sort of thing.
Okay, and while we're just talking about length, does it feel any less authoritative when you handle it? Does it feel like you want that extra barrel?
No, I can't say that it makes any sort of difference. If anything, I think this is authoritative enough.
Right.
I think you could make it even slightly shorter and it would still feel pretty authoritative.
Okay. So, other than that, ergonomically, you could probably just check our Walker episode, I believe, right?
Yeah, there's really not much of a difference. I mean, I want to say this one maybe when it fouled up, the hammer was a little more difficult to operate on this one than the Walker.
So this would be a difference between the manufacturers, whoever reproduced them, this being a Colt 2nd Gen, which I can't remember who their partner in Italy was. Both of them are Italian made, but the finishing on this was a little bit further. This one throughout has had a fairly stiff hammer.
Right.
You ended up having to two-hand the hammer at some point.
Which is interesting because I can... she's still a little stiff. She's still, even though she's been clean, she's still a little bit stiff. I'll just put it right there in the safe
Do you want
position.
to check? Here, let's see.
Okay.
Let's do a quick comparison. Yeah, see?
No, that's totally
This is a
different.
much stiffer hammer.
In general.
And that's just between the manufacturers, unfortunately.
Yeah.
If we swap the springs, maybe, but even then, it's not a guarantee that they'll swap because different manufacturer. It's
Right.
clear. I've compared this to another Dragoon that we have available, and this has some dimensional differences.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So, who's true to form, I don't really know.
And then the only other really noticeable difference actually came when I was shooting it. I was pleasantly surprised with the Walker, especially coming after the Patterson pistols. I expected the loading lever. Thank you. I couldn't think of the word. I'm just like, oh my God, what's the word for it? The loading lever, I expected to drop at any moment, and it never did on the Walker, and I was pleasantly surprised because we went through 2 whole cylinders full on that thing. Meanwhile, this guy, that Dragoon, eventually the lever did fall. Now, granted, we ended up having footage in which it didn't fall, so we were able to utilize that.
Or in testing the gun, because this was a new gun to us, we got some test rounds out of it before Mae started handling, so it was already kind of powdery. So then we go to shoot it for real, and it starts dropping the lever constantly.
Right.
Now, you have to be kind of eagle-eyed, but we ended up taking a small piece of, we actually had like an Allen key that was small enough to fit in there and broke it off. And we stuck it up behind that plunger. Although in this case, it's between a plunger and the rocker, which I covered earlier in this episode. This gun has an incorrect copy of the release latch, as far as I understand it, unless there's some version I don't know about. But it's a pivoting latch, and it's very susceptible to inertia.
Right.
And so we were able to jam it in between and hold it.
And it was just enough of a friction right there that it was able to hold it in place, which is perfect. But frankly, I thought this latch was actually going to be pretty good when I first saw it.
To my understanding, historically, they were. I don't see any real notable complaints about the originals. They probably used very stiff springs, and they were probably, not that much of the piece itself was probably heavy enough to almost act like an inertia lock, because if you think about it, you have this rear-facing latch, and you have this mass, and when the gun goes boom, you already have spring pressure forward, but also the mass of the object wants to stay there too, especially if it were iron, let's say, or some other material other than light steel in the reproduction. And so it's probably going to stay forward as the gun recoils, and it's probably not likely to let itself drop.
No.
But on these reproductions, I suspect that they're getting lighter, softer sprung.
They want to make it easier on the user and also cheaper.
Right. And so I don't think so. I do know most people who even have the reproduction Walkers, this thing starts to let go. We've got probably like 150 rounds through this gun.
I think Maybe dropped once, but I want to say that was user error. I think when it was shot, that person didn't put the lever all the way up.
Right. So for whatever reason, we hit the jackpot on this spring construction for this one.
Now we're going to take it out next, and of course it's going to drop like every time.
Eventually it'll start dropping.
Yeah.
It's going to happen.
It's a matter of time.
Yeah. But this is a fatigue design. It's going to wear out. That is a design that's supposed to keep working.
Yeah, but that was, I think in terms of differences, that's really possibly it between the two of them. Otherwise, like I said, it really did shoot just kind of like a Walker.
Yeah, recoil should have been less. We used a much lighter load.
Presumably, yes, it should have been lighter. I'm trying to remember. I didn't think the recoil was honestly that bad on this one. I do remember the Walker has significant thoom to it, like Schlock Mercenary gun.
It depends on what load we put in it, because we've run everything from 40 to 60 in this thing, just to see what we could get out. 60 would be like the high end of a Walker. I would never have recommended that load in the original. With the modern steels, if you trust the manufacturer, I still wouldn't necessarily recommend it because I don't want to get sued. But you can fit it in there. You know what I mean? So if it happens,
if you can fit it.
Yeah. And the 60 grains tends to be very stout. Anything remotely in the realm of 40, 45, 50, I feel like feels just the same out of this as the max load on that, thanks to the weight differential as it is.
True.
Realistically, the big difference between the two is that when we did the Walker, we didn't demonstrate that safety because, as was covered earlier, I was concerned about whether or not that safety position existed or not for the Walker when we did the research. So I just left it alone because I don't want to say what I don't know.
Fair.
These definitely did have the safety pins on either side of every nipple.
Yep.
The patent for that was released 2 years after the gun. Actually, I think 3 years after the gun, it was patented. So luckily nobody ran off with it, I guess, before that point.
Yeah, fair.
Yeah. And so how do you feel about that safety mechanism?
Yeah, so we've had to put it in a safety position before, and I just remember thinking, this is a little bit awkward. It's not really the easiest to set, which it shouldn't be something I feel that nervous about, and it presumably isn't something I have to worry about, but I guess just because I felt a little bit awkward, maybe unpracticed with it, maybe that was why I was having a bit of a hard time setting it perfectly, easily, smoothly on camera.
You know, here's how it's supposed to work. You're supposed to be able, may I borrow that?
Sure.
You're supposed to be able to have this in the half cock, roll this around, get everything loaded, capped, right? Set it to like just over one click so that not the nipple, but rather the false nipple is sitting there looking.
Right.
And then you're supposed to be able to ride the trigger essentially with your finger, walk the hammer back until the trigger can flip by.
Yeah.
And then you just drop it on down. And you can drop it as fast as slow as you want.
Because it's landing in between.
Right. And then you just sort of, you hear that clunk? And
yep,
you just
it
roll
clunked into place. Yeah.
And then in that position, if you go riding around, this can't slip back and fall.
Right.
The problem is, especially with some of these repros, I don't know what was happening mechanically, and I haven't had the time to go in there and look at it, but sometimes you would be in the half cock, roll everything around, and then when you went to come back, the cylinder wouldn't let you slip that sear and really drop back down until you came really far back.
Right, which is what I had to do, which made me feel like, oh, God, okay, well, I guess I can at least make sure I just hold the cylinder and ride the hammer and trigger as I'm awkwardly putting it down.
Which is fine, by the way. If you have to go further back and it just catches at the half cock, it's not a big deal. But the problem is you're trying to feel for that sear release on the trigger, so you're playing with the trigger thinking you're going to actually slip one.
Right.
And that's not going to be fun.
No.
I don't know about the originals, and I don't know about necessarily, I don't think we have a second repro that we used for the next bit of filming on the next episode. I didn't feel it as bad on that gun as I did on this one, I believe. I think I'm remembering that.
I think I'm remembering that correct as well.
So the mechanism itself is actually extremely good in my mind as a safety mechanism for that time.
Right.
Versus just relying on a half cock. Versus relying on just a rebound notch. The idea that it's there and it would take fairly strong act of God to get that to go back hard enough to index and yet not so hard enough so that it would fall. That's asking a lot of the gun. So I think that's an actually really rugged safety system.
Yeah, it's not too bad. It's a good idea. Just I need to be a little more practiced in concept or with it, I guess.
How'd you feel about your performance on target once you were actually shooting?
I mean, they were a little bit high, but frankly speaking, I would say the grouping itself was pretty decent.
Yeah, you were holding sort of center mass, right?
Yeah. I tend to in general.
And then they were hitting kind of up in the sternum / low neck area?
Yeah, whenever I'm filming for shooting, I don't tend to adjust after my shots have hit. I tend to just kind of continually shoot wherever I'm aiming. That way we get a really good perspective of where everything is grouping.
Unless you're completely off pace right now.
Oh, then yeah, that's totally different.
Every once in a while we get a gun that we have to blade off so much. But,
right, because sights could be damaged or ammo issue. You never know.
Right. So, to me it looked like that would have put a man down just fine in every one of those.
Breathing would have been very difficult, I think, for him.
Okay, so overall, I guess you're saying we have an improvement over the Walker.
Overall, yes, we do have a slight improvement over the Walker.
Oh, only slight.
Yeah, only slight.
I would consider it significant.
I mean, it's still pretty good. Don't get me wrong. It's just not amazingly different. It's just
for me personally, swinging it over to another target and trying to get it to point and hold.
So what are you thinking? Like 40% improvement or like 30% improvement?
I mean, definitely at least 20, 25, which is significant in terms of like. Although the hammer's slower. Hold on, I shouldn't count that hammer because
yeah. So I'm thinking like 20%.
Yeah, if I bring it to the line, I'm just boom there. I don't have to go searching for the front sight. I'm not throwing all this mass around. So.
But yeah, I'm thinking like we're seeing a 20% improvement over the Walker. That's not bad.
So now we have to talk about the real thing, though.
Yeah, that awkward doodad.
We did not cover this in the Walker episode either because. Again, I did not have enough time and resolution at that time to really get into the flask debacle. And also, it hadn't really kicked in yet. Like, it's really important to understand how closely related these two guns are. All the improvements that were made to this gun were made before this was ever issued to a single man. Mm-hmm. So, for me to sit there and talk about the flask and how people felt about it during the Walker episode, I know it's the Walker flask, and some people were upset about that. But the problem is, how? Nobody had gotten in their hands yet. Like, these were already made by the time people are complaining about that, and these are getting issued with that at first, and then... So it's a huge mess. And it's very hard to sort of... That's why the Walker and the Dragoon, I don't think of as separate guns. I should have probably done those episodes just back to back, like we're doing the
If
Dragons.
we'd been able to, but the time that it takes for that is astronomical on our part.
Beat Othais, try to plan 3 of those in a row. And
it was just hectic enough doing 2 of the same.
Yeah, so far the Reprocussion series is taking about 50 to 70% more time than a regular episode.
Right, that's kind of crazy on us.
Yeah, so this is a reproduction flask. It's not even as good as the originals, which were...
Oh, so those would have been better.
Maybe. This might be better, who knows?
Oh, God.
But we already explored it earlier in the episode.
Right.
How does it feel to actually use it, though? Versus, I believe previously we used like my little basket weave flask that's in my possibles bag. Yeah. Where you can just flip it over with your fingertip and just grab it, you know,
so if I were to try to compare the two realistically.
Right, so this is preset measure. You're supposed to just tip it over, shake it up, drop it in.
Yep, and then
shake it
make sure you empty it. Yeah.
It's supposed to throw the same charge every time.
Right. I mean, I don't know if it threw the same charge every time because it's kind of hard to eyeball that, but...
The ranges we were shooting it grouped okay, so it can't be that.
It must have been pretty close for the grouping itself, don't get me wrong. But in terms of usability, I'll take the previous flash just because this one's awkward. That weird little awkward shaking you have to do, it's really slow to load.
The thing I found most surprising, and I don't know how accurate our reproduction is.
What do you mean?
The thing I found, in terms of the size of these two things, is how awkward this...
Oh, it doesn't really fit at all.
No.
So I was just like, I was trying to make sure I definitely got all the powder in there because every once in a while you saw it'd be like a little extra powder on the edge of the cylinder. I'd be like, oh crap. And
I was spilling powder like caked into the mouth of this guy. Would you want to use this in the field?
Not if I had to. Frankly speaking, I am worried just about how fast how slow this is. Like, I just don't see it being reliable either.
I find it so surprising because it seems like a gimmick. Like, it really feels like... And Colt's kind of notorious for this, too. If you look at the early Patterson and you look at this flask, I think Samuel Colt was kind of a gimmick man. And I think a lot of the engineers and other people around him talked him out of the gimmicks.
How many other gimmicks would there have been in the world?
Look at the trigger on the Patterson. Why did it have to be that way? That folding trigger thing?
That was weird.
Yeah, it's kind of a gimmick. But nobody was there to tell him not to knock that crap off. You know what I mean? And so... I feel like when it came to the Walker pistol, And then the sensibilities going into the Dragoon, two men, Walker and Thornton, kind of taught Colt into like, okay, come on, man, just get it back to basics, right? Let's do this simple, let's do it smart. And I'm sure he went through a bunch of gimmicky ideas for this loading latch. And it ultimately ends up being good that he has not working like this one, but he has one that works. But if you stop and think for a second about how this gun's constructed and everything's going on, that's the most gimmicky part, too. And I just see it in that mechanism, too. It's like he's trying to invent a better mousetrap. It sounds like a good idea, but then in
actual
rugged
practice,
use,
yeah. Not so much.
Right. But I would take a traditional flask.
Yeah, me too.
Would you take the gun in that period? In the percussion cap era, would you carry this revolver?
Well, it is a pretty solid caliber. We're talking a 44 ball as compared to the 36 that we had in the others.
You could either have like a larger bore single shot cavalry pistol. You could have the Walker. You could have the Patterson.
Yeah.
I think they were beginning to have pepper boxes, but I don't know that they'd be what people think of. A lot of
Are we talking revolving cylinder pepper box or revolving hammer pepper box?
Revolving cylinder pepper boxes would have been. The problem is I'm having a hard time pinning down dates of some of those early pepper boxes. Most of the ones that people think of actually came after this pistol. And yet they think it came before because mechanically it seems to them simpler. But yes, there were pepper boxes. No, they weren't necessarily the ones you're thinking of. And I'm not exactly sure which ones. But even so, let's just consider that there might have been a pepper box. You would have a single shot pistol pepper box, or effectively this, or that, or a Patterson.
Technically, out of all of them, weirdly, that one comes out slightly on top.
It's a small list, but this is king of the hill, let me tell you.
Yeah, it really is. That's absolutely bizarre to think about, but you're not wrong.
Yeah, but people have got to think about how revolutionary these two pistols really were. Because when they were around, everything else was single shot.
Right.
Everything. It's not until about 1848, 1850... like in that little gap, and I'm still walking down some of the history there, that you start to see some of the like Adams patent double action percussion pistols starting to show up.
Right.
So, or percussion revolvers.
I know.
So, really, if in most of the world, you can have one of these two, or you can have a single shot, and that's all you're getting.
Yeah, I'd definitely go for that Dragoon. If I had the option between the Dragoon and the Walker even.
You know, in that context, I'm surprised at how good it is.
Considering all of its competition surrounding it, yeah, you're not wrong.
Yeah, it's better than it has to be.
Yeah.
I mean, there was a real attempt to make this as rugged as... They were attempting to make it as rugged as a single-shot pistol, which is impossible. But that's what they were attempting to do, and then trying to ruggedize it that way.
Right. And then it comes with a loading lever that effectively is fantastic for loading. You have the thing that you need on the gun to load it.
Right.
That itself is also revolutionary, in my opinion.
Well, not necessarily, because a lot of the single-shot pistols had a loading lever underneath.
Oh,
that
they did?
Pull out, and
Okay.
it would swing over, and it would tamp down.
Oh, okay.
And then it would tuck back away.
Well.
Now, the advantage to those guns is that because of their construction, that system would never ultimately tie up the gun. So it could just sort of hang out there and be an attached... It's essentially a loosely attached rod. A little bit better than a chain, but it's just sort of a rod that's attached to the gun.
Okay, well, never mind then.
With the construction of this, you can't really get away with that.
No.
And you really need a way to press it in.
And technically, this is wrong, because you could, if you drop the lever, it can tie up the action. If it lands just perfectly in one of the
Oh, no, the lever
cylinders,
falling it's not even perfect. It'll eventually do it no matter what. That's sort of the big downside of these guns. But my only problem with that is when people criticize that aspect of it, that you can get a lever tie-up like this.
Yeah.
My problem is you still get the one shot.
Yeah.
Boom. Then, oh no, tie-up. Well, the time it takes to clear the lever problem is, and this one doesn't work great, you would just snap it up, but this one you actually have to tip the thing out of your way, which was why the footage is so weird when you're filming it.
Oh, yeah.
You would just snap that back up, cock it again, and you're back in it, and even if it fell every time, you can't tell me that is somehow slower than reloading the single-shot pistol over and over and over again.
Right, yeah.
Yeah. I'd take this.
Yeah, same here.
I mean, the Dragoon is a fantastic revolver, but... not that.
No, not that.
Never.
I'll just keep the older flask on me and be like, yeah, I got that new flask. It's great. Pulls out the old flask.
Yeah. So,
well, that's pretty much it, I think.
Yeah, we're kind of avoiding over talking.
Basically because we got more.
Yeah, it's almost like there's a whole other two versions of the Dragoon.
It's been on the table the whole time.
So we have to do this all over again next time, and so Mae and I are desperately trying not to step on our own toes.
Right.
But we're going to talk more about the Dragoon. We're going to talk about because it's sort of the beginnings of some other designs. And we'll get a fresh opinion on a differently constructed gun.
Yes.
In our next episode.
We will.
All right. Is there anything else that you have to say about these guys?
Nope. That's pretty much it. Happy to try it. Looking forward to the next one.
Yeah. You guys have a good one.
Yeah.
By the time this is all done, hopefully you'll be frustrated as I am at how impossible it is to actually get representatives of the different features.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, God. But anyway, y'all have a good one.
Bye, everybody.
The update's in the thing. We did it. We're doing the update now.
Oh my God. He literally is like, Mae, start this one. I was like, and he just interrupts me. That's how that goes.
This is the update. We don't normally do them this way, but we knew well in advance what we wanted to say for
Thank you. That's basically what we're trying to say on this one. We want to especially thank...
Mae, say the thing to the people.
Two groups, especially. One, Rock Island Auction. They have been very patient with us. They've waited... Well, now it's been like almost a year since we put out the Walker.
No, has it really been that bad?
I think so. I know. We don't even realize time has passed that far, but they definitely gave us some help, and they were very patient on the wait on that.
These take forever to make. The repercussions take forever to make because one
really
thing always jams it up, and then you have to go make another episode.
Or then you have to get another gun in because you realize, it turns out I don't have enough of a model comparison
here. Or
here.
another book in, or if something's not working, you gotta get a special bullet in.
Or I gotta get a special cartridge set up. Oh my God.
Or we don't have a bullet mold.
That we need to thank Aragon Bullet Molds for. They were honestly very helpful, very responsive. Please do check them out. They were great for you, from what I know.
The Aragon tries to do accurate reproduction molds.
Right.
And they're extremely friendly. You need to email them or get on their email list because they sell out like that.
Like the moment.
And
I'm not kidding.
For us, when we're super slammed, we can't always just go do that, and
so
they don't
the email list really does help.
Yeah, they don't have like a pre-order list or anything like that, so they've been very kind to help us purchase them at the moment they're available, or set one aside for us to purchase so that we could actually get the episodes done.
So direct show help there. Fantastic.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So give them a holler, Rock Island, Aragon.
Yeah, tell them thanks for the help.
Yeah, seriously, tell them, even if you're just on their social media or something, just tell them you appreciate it.
It helps let them know also that what they're doing to help support firearms history is actually making a difference too from the viewer perspective.
Yeah, that's a big one. People don't know you're there unless you tell them you are.
Yeah, so please tell them you are.
Anyway, all right, I guess that's it, right?
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay, well then we have another episode on these coming soon.
Yes.
Otherwise, you have a good one.
Bye, everybody.